Following the 1978 season, the NHL had a lot of tough decisions to make. Not about scheduling, not about how the playoff formats were going to change, but about the Cleveland-Minnesota situation. Now, the 16 NHL amateur draft held at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal was the last to be called an amateur draft before the league created the modern entry draft in '79. In addition, the drafting system that had been in place for 9 seasons made its final appearance in '78. A year later, the annual number of rounds would be predetermined, and teams would no longer be permitted to pass in rounds and then re-enter as they had in the past. In addition, squads would no longer be able to purchase late-round draft picks as they had from '69 to '78. Trades for draft picks after '78 would have to involve players or future non-cash considerations. The '78 draft also marked the last time NHL teams had to compete with the upstart WHA in signing star junior players. Signs of the rival league's demise were already evident, and for the first time in '73, the WHA did not draft in head-to-head competition with the NHL. This enabled the NHL to take the draft out of the secrecy, and it required since 1974. There was no longer need for the conference call format, and once again the draft became a public event at the Queen Elizabeth. Most important, the '78 draft would mark the final time in NHL history that underage players, those who did not turn 20 in their draft year, were ineligible. In '79, this would become the most dramatic and significant change in draft history, but in '78 it was still unimaginable. And while the '78 draft included many historic lasts, it also included historic firsts. The first time teams drafted players selected in the previous draft. Several 1977 draft picks who were not offered contracts within a year had adopted to re-enter the draft in '78. And as I call it, the Gordie Dwyer rule, if a lot of people know my good friend Gordie Dwyer, he was drafted by St. Louis, did not sign with them, then re-entered and Montreal took him. That's a more commonplace right now. Now, once again, the struggling Cleveland franchise, the financial problems were a big issue as the draft day neared. A year earlier, the Barons had saved themselves from folding, even though the uncertainty of their future had forced the NHL to delay its draft. In '78, the Barons weren't so lucky. The team folded, merging its remaining players and ownership group with Minnesota just days before the draft. That left the NHL with the question of how to handle Cleveland's scheduled 1978 draft picks. The league decided to leave only the Barons' first 2 picks in play. The first rounder was moved to the last pick in the round, 18 overall, and then packaged in the Cleveland-Minnesota dispersal draft. The Washington Capitals, who had the dispersal draft number 1, were given the option of selecting the first 2 former Cleveland players or using the number 1 draft pick vacated by Cleveland. Washington opted to pass in the dispersal draft and take the draft pick instead, a good move. Meanwhile, the NHL allowed Cleveland's second-round pick to be used by Washington, which had obtained it from Cleveland in a trade. All of Cleveland's other draft picks were voided, and teams which had traded picks to Cleveland were also forbidden from using these picks. Now, the big winner of this, in my opinion, was St. Louis, who set an individual team record with 31 picks in '78, breaking the previous mark of 27 by Montreal in '77. The Blues achieved this total by purchasing late-round picks from several other squads. St. Louis's record is likely to stand for all time, since the total number of rounds has been restricted ever since the '78 draft, and it is now virtually impossible for one team to accumulate 31 selections in a single draft. On the other hand, Pittsburgh drafted only 3 players in '78, the smallest total by an actively drafting team since the first true universal draft in '69. Overall, the final total of 234 draft picks was the second highest in history, despite the loss of the Cleveland franchise, and represented an increase of 49 players over the 1977 total. Now, in one particular comic moment near the end of the draft, Montreal GM Sam Pollock attempted to make a 6th-round pick before he realized Detroit was still drafting and had the pick ahead of his. Pollock went ahead and announced the name of St. Louis defenseman Brian Crowley. Detroit officials had argued that he had the pick ahead of Montreal, and as a result, they quickly chose Crowley with their 16th pick, just to stick it to the Habs. Ironically, the only future Hall of Famer drafted in '78 didn't reach the NHL for more than a decade. Russian hockey legend Vyacheslav Fedotov, picked in the late rounds by Montreal, finally came to North America in '89, but never played for the first team that drafted him. While 78 wasn't a great draft for Hall of Famers, it was a memorable year for many other groups. The biggest winners were Americans, European, and college players, who were all drafted in record numbers. A whopping 80 drafted collegians, including 73 from the States, broke the old record by 19. In addition, 17 Europeans were drafted, beating the previous high by 9. And a total of 47 Americans broke the previous record by 2. Now, players eligible to the draft were all amateur players born before January 1st, 1959. Draft order, teams drafted in reverse order of the 78 finish. Now, there was no set number of rounds, as squads had the right to pass in any round, and the draft continued until all teams were done selecting. Cleveland did not draft because the team had folded a few days earlier. However, the NHL continued to recognize the first and second round picks that would have belonged to Cleveland. Now, the Barons' first pick, number 15 overall, was dropped to the end of the first round, which was number 18, and given to Washington, which gained it in the Cleveland-Minnesota dispersal draft. Cleveland's second pick, 22 overall, was used by Washington, which had obtained it in a trade. All other Cleveland picks were voided, including those obtained from other squads. As a result, the New York Islanders were barred from using their fourth-round pick, which the team had swapped with Cleveland. Minnesota and Vancouver also passed in round 11, with Vancouver re-entering around 12 and passing again around 13. Buffalo passed in round 12. Chicago, Philly, and the Islanders passed in round 13. Boston passed in round 14. Washington, St. Louis, Colorado, Pittsburgh, LA, Atlanta, and Toronto passed in round 15. The Rangers passed in round 16. Detroit passed in round 18, leaving only Montreal to pick in rounds 18 through 22. Now, rotation, again, Minnesota, Washington, St. Louis, Vancouver, Colorado, Pittsburgh, the Rangers, LA, Detroit, Chicago, Atlanta, the Flames, not the Thrashers, Toronto, Buffalo, Philadelphia, the Islanders, then Boston, who lost to Montreal in the final, and Montreal. Total rounds were 22. Now, the NHL eventually paid a lump sum to the Canadian Major Junior Hockey League to support Major Junior Hockey as a whole. Now, prior to the 78 draft, the NHL also committed to future payments that would ensure the CMJHL continued success as the primary pipeline for NHL caliber talent. NHL President John Ziegler estimated by 1980 the sum of NHL payments to the CMJHL would amount to $30,000 per drafted player. Now, teams could offer a player contract at any time after the draft. Now, the number one pick, of course, was the future Stanley Cup winner with Montreal, but he was taken by Minnesota, Bobby Smith. 95 players that year reached the NHL, a whopping 40.6%. 16 players drafted won a cup, about 6.8%. Most NHL games was by Brad Marsh, 1,086. Most playoff games, Craig McTavish, 193. Highest pick to miss, number 30, was Dal Yakowachuk. Lowest pick to reach was my distant cousin, Louis Schlegel, number 233, and 234 players drafted, 143 forwards, 67 defense, and only 24 goalies. Now, just to recap the picks by rounds, this is one of the best rounds I've ever seen, loaded with talent. The first round, Bobby Smith by Minnesota, Ryan Wallerton by Washington, Babbage Wayne by St. Louis, Delego by Vancouver, Mike Gillis by Colorado, Ben Wilson the Flyers, then Kenny Linsman to the Flyers, Danny Geoffrion to Montreal, Willie Huber to Detroit, Timmy Higgins to Chicago, Brad Marsh to Atlanta, Brent Peterson to Detroit, Larry Playfair to Buffalo, Danny Lucas to Philadelphia, Steve Tambolini to the Islanders, Al Secord to Boston, Dave Hunter to Montreal, and Tim Koulis in the 18 pick. Round 2, the Steelers draft, in my opinion, Steve Payne by Minnesota, number 19, then Paul Mulvey to Washington, Joe Quenneville to Toronto, Kurt Fraser to Vancouver, Paul McKinnon to Washington, Steve Kristoff, the Olympian, to Minnesota, Mike Meeker, which I did a podcast on, Howie's nephew, to Pittsburgh, Don Maloney by the Rangers, Merlin Malinowski to Colorado, the Rockies, of course, Glenn Hicks to Detroit, Gretzky, Keller, Doug LeCouillier by Chicago, Dale Yakwachuk by Montreal, then Al Jensen, Tony McKechnie by Buffalo, Mike Samurda Philadelphia, Randy Johnson, the Islanders, Graham Nicholson, to Boston, and Ron Carter with Montreal. So a very interesting draft all the way around. But let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. When you have so many potential talent that's coming in, like I said, there was a can't-miss draft. There was a lot of talent. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the story of the 1978 NHL draft. Thanks for listening, and keep your stick in the ice. Bye.